Welcome to the Center for Climate and Security's Climate and Security podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Shweta Chakraborty. As viewers are well aware, twice a month we aim to bring you exclusive dialogues with leading thinkers, educators, civil servants, and military personnel who work at the nexus of climate and security. I ask these experts to share with us their views and perspectives of how we can collectively prepare for this time of high consequence risk, particularly that of climate change. Today's podcast guest is Michael Wu, a policy fellow at the Center for Climate and Security. He is also principal at Converge Strategies, LLC, and a fellow with the Resource Security Program at the DC headquartered think tank New America. Michael previously served as a senior advisor on energy resilience and clean energy in the U.S. Air Force, where he founded the Resilient Energy Demonstration Initiative, which we'll discuss. Before that, Michael founded the Defense Energy Program at the Truman National Security Project, which we'll also discuss. Michael, many thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Shweta.
So, you have a lot of interesting things that you'll be sharing with us and the viewers. Let's start with your knowledge on the electric grid. What can you tell us about the current affairs?
So, the electric grid was hailed as the greatest achievement of engineering in the 20th century. And it really came together over the past 150 years organically. So the electric grid, was neighborhoods and cities, and then grew into this large centrally controlled mechanism full of thousands of power plants, of transmission and distribution lines, millions of power lines, and substations, and all the things that get power to these lights, power to these cameras.
Wow. So it's local, national, global even?
Yeah,
or
so
how is it defined?
If you look at the way the electric grid is structured in the United States, there are really three major interconnects or sections of the electric grid on the continental United States. But then it breaks down into dozens of regional transmission operators, and then thousands of companies, both public and private, that actually manage the day-to-day electric grid. So it's a giant mechanism. It's a giant machine with literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of stakeholders.
Wow. So what can you tell us about the security and the resiliency of this grid? We're so dependent on it.
Right, yeah. So as obviously as telecommunications and as our economy has become more globally connected, our interest and our need for access to electricity has only increased. So the electric grid has provided reliable power to the American people for decades, extremely reliable power. We have some of the best reliability rates in the world. But what security experts will tell you now is that there's an increasing risk of long-term widespread power outages today, a fundamentally different risk profile in the threat environment today.
Why would they say that? Where are they getting that from?
Yeah, a few different reasons. Obviously, we're seeing more an increase of extreme weather events. They're becoming more frequent and severe. In 2017, we had the largest power outage in U.S. history in Puerto Rico. Where 80% of the power lines in Puerto Rico were knocked down. More than 200,000 people were permanently displaced from the island, and some are starting to move back, but many have resettled in the continental United States. Natural disasters are increasing, but there's also determined adversaries. We're learning more every day. In fact, recently, the Department of Homeland Security and FBI put out a warning about access that Russian actors and hackers have accessed parts of our critical infrastructure, including gaining access to and publishing the controls to a large power plant. So what we're seeing is an increase of capability and from countries that may be near-peer adversaries, may have an interest in disrupting critical infrastructure.
So would you say the threat is one of the two? It's this natural disaster, if you will, that is increasingly being suggested as human influence, or is it nefarious in nature? Is it both? What is the trade-off between the two?
Yeah, I actually see them as mutually reinforcing. So if you think about the risks that our critical infrastructure faces from a natural, or from the evolving climate, or just from natural causes, I think what we'll also see is that there's an increased risk. That just makes us more vulnerable to somebody who's trying to create effects within the United States, or who's trying to disrupt our economic or national security, who's trying to disrupt critical national defense missions. All of them would be more likely to target an area that they knew was important, but that they also knew was recovering from a disaster or a catastrophic event. I think you're likely to see in the future more of a focus on having access to and disrupting those kinds of scenarios to create cascading effects and greater vulnerabilities and risks.
So really targeting those more vulnerable areas or locations.
Potentially targeting more vulnerable areas and locations, potentially timing those disruptions to coincide with recovery efforts. I think we're likely to see, if you think about who and why folks might be targeting our critical infrastructure, we're likely to see those be targeted at our most vulnerable moments.
So this isn't just about not being able to play your video games or turn your lights on in your apartment or have your watching this on your laptop, perhaps with your laptop plugged into the outlet. These are significant security issues that you're suggesting is potentially in the future. What does this look like? How does this play out? What can we expect in the worst case scenarios?
Sure. So absolutely. If you think about what we rely on for electricity, it's everything. It's telecommunications, it's financial services, it's critical national defense missions. So the Department of Defense, as you know, is the largest consumer of energy in the world. In the continental United States alone, we have a $4 billion energy profile and market, and we rely on access to electricity for almost every part of our national defense mission. So whether that's, we've really changed the way we fight over the past few decades. We have critical national defense missions that are tied to access to electricity here at home. If you're thinking about remotely piloted aircraft that are serving in battlefields in Afghanistan or other places, those are piloted often from the continental United States. If you're thinking about the global positioning system and the constellation of satellites that serve that global positioning system that coordinate both civilian and military movements across the world, those are flown and guided from the continental United States. So we have critical national defense missions that are tied to uninterrupted access to electricity here at home. And we're seeing those at risk. They are tied to many of the same civilian electric grid as our homes and businesses. We have in the Air Force and in the other military services resilience measures in place, but they're mainly emergency backup generators. And we've never really confronted, and we're just starting to really tackle what happens when, if we're faced with a long-term widespread power outage. And that's been really the focus of military installation energy policy over the past, over the past 4 or 5 years. And that's been a real shift.
So it's not just the inconvenience of having your lights go out.
Right.
I mean, this is significant. So what are we doing to address these risks? How are we going to adjust ourselves and our security protocols to be more resilient then?
So that's a great question. I think there are a number of things that are happening both within the military, also within the national security apparatus, the U.S. government, and then also within utilities and communities to try to become more resilient to some of these risks. Within the military, you're seeing investments in microgrids, you're seeing investments in on-site energy generation, whether that be from renewable sources or natural gas or other ways of powering installations. You're seeing an increase in battery storage systems that are being deployed alongside some of those assets so that we can store that electricity and use it when it's needed. Electricity, people forget, is the only commodity that's produced and consumed at the speed of light. And so managing that balance between supply and demand is incredibly difficult, and so requires a lot of engineering. Within the civilian, with U.S. government, national security apparatus, the Department of Energy is taking a real lead on doing more and bigger exercises. They've got new authority as the sector for the electric grid expert. Like, they're the ones who have responsibility for maintaining the security of the electric grid, and they're working across government and with a lot of utilities on new standards, on exercises, on different ways that we can ensure that we're as prepared as possible for some of these risks.
Sure.
Department of Homeland Security also is being much more transparent, I think. I think information sharing between businesses and the government on risks is a real challenge between the CEOs and of the electric sector and security offices of the electric sector, making sure that when they see things on their system, they're communicating that to our national security apparatus and intelligence community, and that and vice versa, so that you're seeing real conversation now in a way that I don't think we saw 2 decades ago.
Sure. And I was going to just say, I imagine there probably wasn't a lot of cross communication there because there wasn't that same need that we now have with all of the threats that you so clearly described to us. And so that collaboration, that communication, are you seeing it beyond the public-private conversations? Are you seeing additional stakeholders get involved? What are the opportunities for collaboration, and how are people playing their various roles and different organizations playing their roles? And where do you fit in?
Yeah, so I think that's a good framing. I think one of the things that we're learning is, just like the military and just like the federal government, everybody has critical energy requirements. Businesses, tech companies in particular, when you're thinking about huge data centers and all the information that's being transferred and stored and critical to running a 21st century economy, all of them in some way tie back to access to electricity. And so I think we're seeing a lot more focus cross-sector on things like the interdependency between the electric sector, telecommunications, financial services, and other utilities, our gas system, water and wastewater, all the things that have some tie back to electricity, but if disrupted, would have detrimental effects to the American people. I think local and state governments are getting more involved, but I think that is a place where we need to provide tools to folks who want to be involved and act in order to sort of catalyze their ability to be involved. Where do we fit in? So I started a company coming out of the Air Force called Converge Strategies. We're a consulting company that's focused on the intersection of advanced energy, resilience, and national security. Really, our core belief and our core interest is there's a constellation of people in this community who are brilliant and who are mission-driven and who work in different sectors and have different areas of expertise. And we hope to connect them and align them around a set of common objectives and a sense of common values.
Hence Converge?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, no, that's fantastic. And I think you're seeing a real opportunity here as this becomes a challenge that we increasingly need to address. So what have you seen? We have increased collaboration, we have communication, there's an increasing awareness. But what has the challenge been really to move forward in the way that we need to in terms of science, innovation, collaboration? What would you, in an ideal situation, like to see changed in that regard?
I think about an electric grid someday that is powered where energy generation is extremely distributed, where neighborhoods are powering themselves. They're connected to the larger grid when they need to and when it makes economic sense, but they can separate off and run themselves when that makes more sense, or when there's, what we need to do is avoid the kinds of cascading failures that our adversaries might try to cause, where you could take down entire portions of the electric grid. If we have the capability to power military bases, to power local communities, to power important businesses and critical enclaves, then that's going to be an electric grid that's more secure. By nature, a lot of these distributed energy sources are cleaner than the big central power plants that we use to power the grid today. And that should, if economics continue, if the price of solar and the price of energy storage continue in the direction that they've been going, should be more efficient and cheaper as well.
Right, it becomes more viable. So
That's
the
right.
real issue is that the lack of adoption is linked to the lack of viability or the ease of viability in this moment. But like everything else we see, as technology advances, it becomes that much easier to adopt. So this is something that we'll increasingly see, in your opinion, that people will embrace and want to actively adopt?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a huge economic opportunity. And so, my hope is that it will take new thinking, but that increasingly utility companies and developers will embrace this restructured electric grid because they see it as in their economic interest. So for most of the 20th and 21st century, the business model for utilities has been, let's build more because we can make more. They're regulated. They have a particular rate of return that they're allowed to make. But once that, and so their incentives are just to build more transmission infrastructure and build large centralized power plants because they make money based on how much they build. I think we're seeing, in particular, electric companies move to a more service-oriented approach where it's actually the level of service and quality of service that they deliver to their customers that is in their economic interest. And we need to do more to get regulators, public utility commissions, and policymakers the tools to prioritize and justify those kinds of investments because they'll help accelerate the progress toward that energy transformation to a more distributed, cleaner, more secure electric grid.
Sure. And what are the other types of incentives? Not just making it more affordable necessarily, but how else do we really kind of raise awareness about how this really is a benefit overall to all stakeholders involved?
Yeah, I think it's critical again to focus on who those critical customers are, whether they're whether they're military bases, whether they're supermarkets, whether they're local and state government facilities, whether they're hospitals and first responders, and then make it easy for them. We need to make resilient energy systems products that people can buy. What we have right now, you pay an electric bill, I pay an electric bill. It doesn't give you an option to check like resilient on my electric bill. We need to be able to create qualities of service between different between different options. And those are all relatively nascent technology sets that we're talking about. Battery storage globally is projected to expand sixfold over the next 10 years. That's the kind of growth that the solar industry just experienced, where you're seeing exponential proliferations of those kinds of distributed energy resources. The question is, are we going to design the system with principles in mind that will ensure that those investments are made in such a way that they're strengthening the resilience of the grid? Because they don't necessarily have to be. In fact, a lot of security experts would say, hey, we're creating all of these new points of vulnerability, or we're creating new attack surfaces by implementing all these distributed energy resources onto the grid. So it will take intentional and thoughtful design and planning and standards and policy in order to ensure that the investments that we're likely to see just on an economic basis also strengthen security and resilience.
Great, good to know. Give us a little snapshot of what's happening right now with energy. What would viewers be surprised to hear about? Where has technology taken us? What are the new sources of energy we could potentially hear about from you and get excited about? Snapshot currently of the energy space.
Yeah, so we're obviously seeing a huge increase of solar deployment on the electric grid. A lot of that has been large utility scale, multi-dozen megawatt installations. I think what we'll increasingly see is increased penetration for solar rooftops. And what I'd hope to see is increased both on commercial and industrial customers, but also for residences, increased deployment of battery storage of that, so that you can actually run your electric system on your own. No determined adversary, at least to date, has been able to stop the sun from shining. So there's a strength in that diversity of resource. It's extremely valuable to ensure that we're able to have that access to electricity at all times. And in particular, we should be thinking about how those resources are being used together to maintain that balance between supply and demand that I talked about before. There's no question we're seeing a lot of natural gas being used for electricity production today. Natural gas and solar and wind in many places have really displaced traditional coal-fired electricity generation, have increasingly displaced nuclear power, just based on economics, based on price.
Sure. So to what extent has the military taken up these different types of sources?
Yeah, so the military has deployed a lot of renewable and distributed energy resources. In many ways, they're leading the way on deployment of these resilient energy systems like microgrids on their installations. The Obama administration had a 1 gigawatt goal for renewable energy deployment on its installations. There's also law in place and goals in place based on those laws. But it requires real focus from leaders. The military certainly now has made resilience a key tenet of its energy policy. In fact, it's probably the primary goal that each of the military services and the Department of Defense have articulated for their energy programs. But what we're not seeing as much of is the kinds of deal flow, the kinds of like I said before about productizing resilient energy systems. We're not seeing repeatable and scalable projects being deployed throughout critical military installations at I think the pace that's really needed to confront this threat. So,
what was the reason for that, you think?
I think it's hard. I think every microgrid and every military installation, they're all unique. Every energy system is unique, and so I think it's very hard for the military, to work with the private sector in a way that that makes those things repeatable and scalable to the level that is needed. But the only way we're going to get there is to continue to make progress and to really make that our intentional goal.
Sure. And we also see a lot of military installations are within communities. And so there's something to be said for if the military is able to get this moving, the communities surrounding the various bases and installations will benefit, wouldn't you say? So there is going to be a mutual benefit potentially to the citizenry.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think it's right in two ways. One is it's incredibly important because most of our service members who are serving on our military installations in the continental United States don't live on that base, and so if the base has power but the community doesn't, people, they will prioritize their families in some cases over their jobs, and I don't think we can question that. So it's incredibly important that we're thinking about, as we make resilience investments, that we're thinking about how do we ensure that the people that our military relies on in order to accomplish our critical national defense missions are being taken care of, that their families are being taken care of. And so there's no question that that's going to be an important component. But the other part of your point that I think is important to note is there's a long heritage of military to civilian technology crossover, and whether it is GPS or microwaves or lasers, we've found consistently that technology that was developed for a military purpose has transformed the way our economy works, the way our civil society works. And so, that's an important component that we should be continuing to invest in. Like, the military is a great technology validator, and as we noted before about critical energy requirements, technology that's being tested and used and deployed by the military should also have huge commercial potential and benefits.
Yeah, so there's a lot. It's a win-win situation if it's done well. And so, what can the public do? What can viewers of this conversation do to kind of further this along? I mean, we're obviously doing our role and talking to the military. You're playing your part. Right. What can we ask the average viewer to do?
Yeah, well, and that was a question I thought about and had for you. One was, I'm sure that the average listener and viewer of this podcast may have an interest in national defense and security more than the average person. So I would say there are three things. One, for your viewers who are in the defense community, start thinking about critical infrastructure that is supporting weapon systems and platforms as important as those weapon systems and platforms. When we think about budgeting and when we think about providing for our national defense, we generally prioritize aircraft, ships, and we need those. On the other hand, many of those weapon systems and platforms rely on critical infrastructure in order to execute their missions and in order to operate. And so we should start thinking about those as one and the same. To folks in the national security community, start thinking about critical infrastructure or continue expanding thinking about critical infrastructure of the United States, of the domestic United States, as something that needs to be considered in long-term national security and defense planning. And then third, for everybody who's not in those communities and who's not involved, I think start thinking about start preparing. How are you helping to accelerate this energy transformation? Whether it's putting whether it's putting solar on your home, whether it's ensuring that if you already have solar on your home, that you're looking into batteries and energy storage systems that can be deployed for you, or that you're asking these kinds of questions to your elected leaders and policymakers. Nobody goes to Public Utility Commission meetings except for people who are professionally involved in them. That can change. If we start organizing and getting involved and saying this is something that we want, that's something that can change. And so people will be, I think, very receptive to and really open to that kind of public involvement. So I'd ask for that.
Well, that's a great way to end this conversation. I think you're really making it clear what we need the viewers to do. Those who are paying attention and listening can really get involved and get engaged in a way that we haven't seen before, but maybe is going to be the new sort of trend going forward. So thank you for that so much and for sharing all this information. And it's heartening to know that you're doing what you're doing. And please come back and join me on the podcast. Thank
Absolutely.
you, Michael.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Climate and Security Podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Please tweet me directly at SWETAC or the Center for Climate and Security's Twitter handle. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, write a review on iTunes, share widely, and finally, consider donating to the podcast from the Center of Climate and Security's podcast page, www.climateendsecurity.org/podcast, by clicking on Make a Donation. We will continue this series of conversations with the most prolific and dedicated folks in this space, and your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you, and please tune in again for the next episode of the Climate and Security Podcast.